You've spent the last few years perfecting the art of being agreeable. You learned to laugh at the right moments, to nod in agreement before you even processed if you agreed, to soften your opinions until they fit within the space others made for you. And despite this, or because of it, people left, one by one. No fights, no visible betrayals, just a silence that grew until it filled the space where conversation used to be. You interpreted this as personal failure, but Carl Jung would have disagreed. For him, this silent withdrawal of people around you isn't proof that you failed to maintain connections. It's proof that you stopped feeding characters that were never yours. Most people confuse loneliness with abandonment. They think that if people disappear, it's because something in them broke, or because the world judged them insufficient. But there's a colder, more precise interpretation. Relationships are built on mutual expectations, invisible contracts that no one signs, but everyone fulfills. And when a person starts to change internally, when they stop playing the role they took on to be accepted, the contract breaks. Not because the bond was fake, but because it was never meant to survive the truth. Think about the last time you felt you needed to explain yourself for no longer being who you used to be. You tried to justify your absence, your change of mood, your sudden desire to be quiet at a party. You thought you were disappointing someone. However, looking at it more coldly, something else was happening. For the first time, you were ceasing to perform a version of yourself created solely to keep others comfortable. And this, in Jung's vocabulary, has a name. It's called the dissolution of the persona, the social mask we build so early that we forget it's a mask. The exhaustion you feel after socializing isn't physical tiredness. It's the exhaustion of maintaining a coherent character for hours on end, adjusting every sentence so as not to bother anyone, calculating every silence to make it seem natural. When this mask begins to crack, the relationships that depended on it crack along with it. Friends who liked your performative version feel, without being able to name it, that something has changed in you. And they are right. It has changed. Except the change isn't a loss of identity. Then it's the opposite. It's the first appearance of an identity that never had the space to exist. This is where most people make the mistake of trying to rebuild the bridges exactly as they were before, going back to laughing at the same jokes, feigning interest in the same topics, reclaiming the usual spot. But what's underway isn't a passing crisis. It's a process of individuation, the term Jung used to describe the often solitary path through which a person stops living according to external molds and begins to become who they truly are. And every process of individuation demands losses. Not because individuation is cruel, but because it is selective. Only those bonds that did not depend on your mask to exist will endure. Without the social routine filling every hour of the day, something begins to surface. At first, it seems like pure discomfort, an unsettling void, a nameless restlessness. You try to fill this void with more noise, more notifications, more series, more commitments that mean nothing beyond occupying space. But silence, when not anesthetized, begins to function as a mirror. And mirrors don't lie. They simply reflect what's there, unfiltered, unedited, without the company of third parties to distract the gaze. It's in this mirror that questions arise, questions that a full agenda conveniently kept at bay. Why do you agree to things you don't believe in? Why do you feel relief when a social engagement is cancelled? Why, deep down, are you afraid of what you might discover if you were alone long enough? These questions don't arise because you've gotten worse. They arise because for the first time, there isn't enough social noise to drown them out. Loneliness doesn't create these internal conflicts. It merely stops hiding them. It is precisely at this point, when silence ceases to be empty and begins to demand answers, that most people realize they lack the tools to deal with what emerges. They know how to manage meetings, deadlines, elevator conversations, but they don't know what to do when faced with their own minds when they finally have space to speak. It was with exactly this turning point in mind that I prepared the Código do Despertar for you. It's not another motivational course full of loose phrases. It's an inner map based directly on Carl Jung's psychology, built for those 60 days when silence stops being frightening and starts to guide. Each day brings an objective lesson, a conceptual key, a question that cuts deep, a statement to anchor what has been understood. You read, perform a concrete microaction, and record your reflection in a journal, transforming the emptiness that bothers you today into direction. If this discomfort you feel when you are alone with yourself is no longer strange and has started to sound too familiar, the first pinned comment has the complete path. Leave a word in that comment. Present, a symbolic commitment to the part of you that is now asking for attention. Returning to what emerges in this silence, not everything that surfaces is comfortable. Jung gave a specific name to the collection of all that has been repressed, denied, hidden, so that you could be accepted. He called it the shadow. And the shadow is not an abstract concept from a psychology book. It is made of very concrete things. The anger you swallowed to avoid seeming difficult, the ambition you hid to avoid seeming arrogant, the boundary you never set for fear of losing someone. Buried things don't disappear, they ferment. And what ferments long enough doesn't die. It leaks. It leaks as resentment in close relationships, as disproportionate irritation in small situations, as a chronic fatigue that no doctor can explain. Loneliness, when sustained, forces you to look at this shadow head-on, because there is no one else around to whom you can project it. And here is another mechanism that Jung described with surgical precision: projection. You don't fall in love with the person, you fall in love with the role they play, the non-judgmental listener, the savior who resolves chaos, the mirror that reflects only the image you want to see. As long as there are people around fulfilling these roles, the shadow remains comfortably outsourced. Alone, it has nowhere else to run, and it is precisely this cornering that forces the encounter. This encounter is often described as suffering, but a more accurate interpretation is different. It is your first real contact with yourself, without intermediaries. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean becoming the anger, the ambition, or the resentment you repressed. It means recognizing that these parts exist, that they are part of the whole, and that denying them only makes them more destructive. A person who has never confronted their shadow is not balanced. They are merely someone whose shadow has not yet found a crack through which to leak. But a cold caution is necessary here, because not all loneliness leads to this maturation. There is a structural difference between the solitude that transforms and the isolation that merely protects. The former is chosen, or at least accepted, as a space for confrontation. The latter is built as a fortress against the possibility of being hurt again. On the outside, the two look identical. The same absence of people, the same silent days, the same refusal of social commitments. On the inside, they are opposing processes. The criterion is not how much time you spend alone, but what that time produces. Transformative solitude leaves residues of clarity. You better understand your patterns, you recognize with more honesty your fears, comes out of the experience with less need for approval no longer. Defensive isolation produces the opposite. It reinforces distrust, hardens resentment, turns every new human approach into a potential threat. A person emerging from deeper, more bitter solitude, more convinced that nobody's any good, wasn't transforming. They were just shielding themselves. This distinction matters because many people use the discourse of individuation as an elegant excuse for fear. It's easier to say, "I'm finding myself," than to admit, "I'm afraid of being rejected again." Jung never described solitude as a trophy. He described it as a phase of work, painful, necessary, but with a specific purpose: to prepare the ground for more honest reconnection, not for permanent isolation disguised as wisdom. Jung's own biography illustrates this boundary with almost didactic clarity. After his break with Freud, he went through years of what he himself called a confrontation with the unconscious, a period of deep instability, intellectual uncertainty, almost total isolation from the professional circle that had previously supported him. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't motivational. They were years of real doubt, with no guarantee that it would lead anywhere. And yet, it was precisely from this period that the central concepts of his work were born. The very concept of the shadow, the individuation process, the idea of archetypes that would shape decades of psychology after him. The important detail isn't that Jung suffered and then succeeded, that reading is too superficial. The detail is that he allowed the period of rupture to function as raw material, rather than trying to fill it in haste with distractions or rushed reconciliations. He documented his own dreams, confronted his own inner images with almost clinical rigor, treated his own collapse as research data, not as an emergency to be silenced. This is what separates fertile isolation from sterile isolation, the willingness to examine rather than just endure. And it is precisely at this point of the journey, when a person has already recognized the shadow, has already distinguished solitude from escape, but still doesn't know how to translate this clarity into practical direction, that most people get stuck. They understand the problem intellectually but lack the daily structure to sustain change after the insight. That's why the Awakening Code was designed as a process, not a single epiphany. 60 days of direct guidance, each with an objective conceptual key and a practical micro-action. No loose theory without application. You don't need to go through alone what Jung went through in years. The inner map has already been drawn. The first pinned comment still has access. If you've recognized your own shadow in this mirror, don't let that recognition die in reflection. Comment present and begin. After the shadow is recognized, and after the difference between transformation and defense becomes clear, something changes in the way new bonds are built. The person who has gone through this process stops seeking a high volume of relationships. They stop collecting acquaintances, stop having conversations just to fill silence, stop approaching anyone just to not be alone. The criterion shifts from quantity to mutual recognition. This explains why, on the other side of individuation, friendships become rarer, but also denser. It's not selectivity out of arrogance. It's that when you stop performing a generic persona, only those capable of recognizing the real, unedited version of who you are remain close. Relationships like these require less artificial maintenance and produce less wear and tear, because they don't depend on constantly maintaining a synchronized mask. Two people who meet after having confronted their own shadows don't need to pretend a coherence they don't feel. They each already know the price of hiding parts of yourself, and for that reason they don't demand it from each other. This is why the phase of solitude, when navigated successfully, does not end in permanent isolation. It ends in selection. The people who remain, or those who arrive later, are not substitutes for old friendships. They are bonds of a different nature, based on who you are now, not on who you had to pretend to be before. And this brings us to the point that most people completely misunderstand. Not having friends is not the goal. It is not proof of superiority. It is not a medal for those who have evolved more than others. It is not a reason for silent pride. It is a stage, temporary by definition. The phase between the collapse of the old identity and the formation of genuine bonds is painful precisely because it is transient. It was not meant to be inhabited forever. Psychological maturity is not proven by the number of people around you, nor by their absence. It is proven by another criterion, colder and harder to fake: self-esteem stopping its dependence on external approval. When this happens, the person can belong to the world, have conversations, create bonds, be part of groups, without needing to abandon who they truly are. They stop negotiating their own identity in exchange for company. You can close this video now and go back to filling the silence with noise, avoiding the shadow. Maintaining relationships that only survive as long as you continue performing who they expect you to be. It is a valid choice, although it comes with a price paid little by little without warning. Or you can accept that this phase of apparent loss is not the end of anything. It is the mandatory passage before any true bond. The Awakening Code exists precisely for this passage. 60 days to navigate what Jung navigated alone, now with a map in hand. The first pinned comment has everything you need to start today. The illusion that solitude is failure has already been dispelled. What you do with this information, from now on, is entirely yours.